Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville, and welcome to my newly formed ongoing series of watch collecting for dummies. I previously did a 101, which was I'm going to, in retrospect, label the rules, and that was really about. I can sum that up really quickly, as one wag in the comments did. If you want to be a watch collector, have some rules about what you buy and then ignore them when you have to. That's actually probably a fair summation of what I spent about 20 minutes saying. I think I added a bit more value than that, so you can go back and look at that previous video. I'll have a link in the notes below. But very quickly, what I did say was that was really about the idea that what defines a collector is that a collector has rules about what they want to buy, rules about what's in their box. That's what separates their collection from just an accumulation of crap that's sort of built up over years. Okay, so with that in mind, I never had a thought that I would continue on, but I've sort of been thinking about and penning some ideas, and I decided it'd be kind of fun to turn this into a series. So if that was 101, this is going to be 102, and the topic of 102 is the list. So the first thing I would say is, as I said before, the one thing about having a collection is that you have to set your own rules. Your rule could be that you'll only have one watch, in which case the concept of a list, which I'm going to talk about now, might be irrelevant to you. If that's the case, save yourself some time, go buy yourself a coffee, stop watching this now. Conversely, you could have well and truly blown past this beginner lesson, already know exactly what you want and not be likely to shift. Again, stop the video, go grab yourself a coffee. There's nothing much more for you to see here now. If, on the other hand, you're not sure where to go next, so you kind of know what you like, or you know what you like, you've made a bit of a list, but on mature reflection, you're thinking maybe you'd been a bit hasty, stay here and have a think about, and have a watch, and maybe it'll be helpful. Okay, so we're going to talk about the list. First off, a quick definition of the list. Most watch collectors that I talk to have in their heads some idea of the watches that they want to buy. Sometimes it's a vague, I kind of want to buy these 3 watches one day. Sometimes, and I'll plead guilty to this, it is a multi-line complex spreadsheet that you keep on your computer, tracking exactly what reference numbers you're looking for to add to your collection. That list could be as short as one watch, you lucky sods. That list could have 45 items on it and be still growing, which is where I am. And it doesn't matter how formal or informal your list is. It doesn't matter how big or how small your list is. This video is really just about the idea that you would have a list. The first thing I would say is there's only one rule to this part of the lecture series, and that is that your list must be your list. It cannot be someone else's list. Other people can help you, guide you, inform you, but no one else can make your list for you. So that's the only rule that I would impose on anyone for having a list. Okay, now the next part is, so how do we go about making that list? Not a rule, but something I would strongly advise is let people like Teddy Baldessar and those guys go for a little while, and under no circumstances check out any other YouTubers' lists. It is a staple of the YouTube community that we all come up with 10 watches for this, 5 watches for that. I've done it. I've done a previous one. I've kind of stopped. I might do one in the future. If I do and you're not sure what you want to buy, ignore my list. Don't go with other people's lists. They will artificially constrain you. And that is probably the biggest issue with them. They will lock you. They don't lock you into anything. You can break free, but most people aren't that strong. I would avoid them like the plague. Okay, so now you're out on your own and you have to do your own research. That sounds really bad, but that research means hang around on the internet and looking at watches. So how bad can it be? So what I would suggest now is that what I would normally say here is grab a whole bunch of catalogs or something and then just scan through the catalogs. Now that's quite difficult to do unless you're a weenie like me who, when you got into this topic, just started buying old catalogs and old magazines to show you watches. But another good place to go, and a place I'd recommend as a starting point, would be Chrono24. I mention them a lot, but no, I am not sponsored by them. I'm not saying that you necessarily buy from Chrono24, but on any given day, Chrono24's got over 250,000 watches in it for sale that cover pretty much every watchmaker over a huge watch period. And it's got these great filtering processes that are really excellent. So what I'd suggest you do is go to somewhere like Chrono24 and then start filtering. And filter according to your rules. So filter, if for me, for example, one of my standard filters is must be automatic, must be men's, must be steel, must cost less than $3,000 or $4,000 if I'm feeling generous to myself, must have a GMT function, must have a water resistance rating of 100 meters or more, and then that's you may want to, me personally, I'm perfectly happy with going for older watches. In fact, quite often I'll deliberately go for older watches. So I will select anything but new or new old stock. Flip that around. If you're interested in really only stuff that's currently on the market, just say that all you want to look at is new stuff from dealers. Run that search. Notice what I left off. I left off brand. Because at this point, one of the greatest mistakes you can make is to focus in on the brand that you want. That is how, it's that notion of focusing on a brand this early that's kind of, and it's fueled by the YouTube community that ends up restricting your choices in the long run. So run that and then see what pops out. If you do run that search, you will probably find that there are 50 brands that come back in return. Some brands that you've never heard of, some brands that you've never even considered, but at this point, still not look at that. What I'd suggest next is you simply start at the top and scroll down, ignoring the brand, just look at the watch, and if you like it, just hit the love heart, just favorite it. Then what I'd suggest you do is go through that. Once you've got that and it's on your notepad, just go through that process again, kicking out the watches which on further reflection aren't really doing it for you. You might end up with 5 watches. In my case, I ended up doing that search. I ended up with about 500 watches on my list. And then I started thinking, okay, so what are there any other rules that would discriminate against this? For example, you might say, I don't want anything less than 38 millimeters. So that might get rid of another 20 or 30 watches. You don't want anything more than 44 millimeters. That might get rid of a few more. Just keep winnowing it down. Never looking at the brand, never looking at the company that's making it, just the characteristics of the watch. Then at the end, you'll have a list. I don't know what your list would look like. I don't know what your search parameters will be. Then again, now just go through this process over and over again, just flicking out watches you don't like, keeping watches that you do. When it gets down to a manageable number, which would be highly variable depending on who you are, at that point, now you want to start researching individual watches. And this is where brand might become important to you. So once you've got down to your selection of, let's just say, 50 watches, you can't find anything more just by looking at them. You can't find anything else that would discriminate against them. This is where some of the branding and some of the finer decisions that require more research start to kick in. Maybe you only want to go for in-house movements, which you will struggle to do at this price point in our theoretical search, but maybe that's what you want to do. If that's what you want to do, then start kicking out anything that's got an ETA movement in it. Maybe on the other hand, you're like me. I actually prefer to go to an ETA movement. It's kind of a recognizing where I am and the kind of collector I am. I like to have lots of watches, having lots of watches, each with a manufacturer movement, each that needs to go to somewhere else, each that might cost a little bit more to get serviced, is a real downer for me. So I tend to focus on deliberately ETA and Solita movement watches. But that's, as I said, my choice. Your choice might be quite different. So whatever it is that's driving you, just keep winnowing it down, now looking at individual watches. At some point, you will get down to a list of 20 watches, 5 watches, 10 watches, 100 watches that you just cannot make any smaller. Congratulations, that's your list. Now that sounds like a huge amount of work, and that might mean that you end up spending a lot of time looking at watches which you eventually end up throwing away. You might end up investing a lot of time looking at watches which, when you get right down to the end of it, you say, I like the design, I liked everything about it, but I just can't connect to that brand. I can't connect to that movement. I can't bring myself to buy a watch from, that former Eastern European Warsaw Pact country. All of those are perfectly legitimate reasons for pushing a watch out. I have personally done all of those things. So there's nothing wrong with that. But I wouldn't say the time was wasted. I mean, first off, you're a watch collector. This is our hobby. How can be looking at watches be considered wasting time, more or less than anything else we do in this hobby? The second thing is, you may end up with a list that looked an awful lot like the one that you wanted to sketch out in the beginning. Maybe you genuinely did an excellent job of narrowing in on the kinds of things that you were interested in very early, and you didn't really need to go through this process. Okay, so what you have done is confirmed what you wanted. In my case, going through that process, which I won't say I invented, because I clearly didn't, someone would have done it before, but which I sort of developed for myself and then ran myself through about probably 2 or 3 months ago. What it did is radically change my list. Brands which I was actively saving for and desperate to try and get hold of have suddenly vanished from the list. Brands which I had kind of dismissed or hadn't even occurred to me that I would be interested in them are now front and center, things I'm desperately searching for. So for me, when I went through this process, it radically changed the watches I was interested in. So it's really interesting how that worked out for me. I'd be interested to know in the comments, do you have your list? How did you come up with your list? Do you ever question it and go back and from first principles try and redevelop it? Do you find that if you've had a list for so long, you actually find it difficult to drop a watch off because you feel like you've committed to it even though you don't own it? Which, by the way, is something I went through. I found when I ditched my old list and came up with a brand spanking new one, I felt bad about the ones I'd crossed off the old list and was trying to find them back on. It's weird how this psychology works. Anyway, that's it for me. That's Watch Collecting 102, how to make the list, my handy hints, and one and only rule. If you enjoyed this, please like it. Please subscribe to the channel. There's more stuff like this about just me fumbling around, trying to come up with ways of thinking about watches that are a little bit different and broadening the scope of our hobby to things that other people aren't necessarily covering. Thanks very much. I've been Pete McConville. This is Not So Obvious Watches. Catch you later. Bye.